The natural world often appears governed by rules that never change. Light gives way to darkness. Hunters move, others hide. Life follows patterns repeated so many times that they begin to feel permanent. From a distance, it seems orderly, almost predictable. But beneath that surface, something far less stable is always at work. As the day fades, the landscape exhales. Heat trapped in stone and soil loosens its grip, drifting upward into a sky that deepens from gold to blue, then to black. Shadows stretch and merge until boundaries disappear. What was visible moments ago dissolves into suggestion. Distance becomes uncertain. Sound travels differently. The world does not sleep, it recalibrates. In these hours, survival is no longer defined by force alone. Speed loses its advantage. Strength becomes situational. What matters now is timing restraint and the ability to read changes too subtle to announce themselves. The night does not reward those who act quickly. It rewards those who act correctly. For countless generations, animals have adapted to these rhythms. They move when they are meant to move. They wait when waiting is safer. These instincts, refined through loss and repetition, have shaped lives that depend on doing what has always worked. In most cases, that is enough. But nature is not static. And instinct, no matter how ancient, is not immune to change. Sometimes the environment shifts just slightly. A temperature drops faster than expected. A sound arrives where silence should be. A presence is felt before it is seen. These moments are small, almost insignificant on their own. Yet in the wild, small deviations are rarely harmless. They create gaps, brief windows, where familiar rules no longer apply. The danger is not always immediate. It does not always arrive in the form of claws or teeth. Often it begins as hesitation, a pause where movement was expected, a decision delayed by uncertainty. In those moments, survival hangs not on aggression, but on interpretation, on understanding whether the world has changed and by how much. Across deserts, plains, forests, and coastlines, life continues to operate under the assumption that yesterday's patterns will hold. Most of the time they do. But when they don't, the consequences are rarely dramatic at first. They accumulate quietly, spreading outward through behavior rather than violence. One misjudgment influences the next. One deviation reshapes the environment that follows. The night amplifies this effect. Darkness removes confirmation. It strips away certainty and leaves only probability. Animals no longer react to what they see, but to what they believe might be there. Survival becomes an exercise in managing risk rather than seizing opportunity. And in that space between action and restraint, the balance of power begins to shift. This is where familiar roles start to blur, where hunters no longer control outcomes, where the absence of something can matter more than its presence, where survival is shaped not by who acts first, but by who understands what has already changed. Nature does not announce these moments. It does not mark them as turning points. They pass unnoticed, buried beneath routine, until their effects become impossible to ignore. By then, the rules that once protected life no longer apply in the same way. What follows is not chaos, but adjustment. A slow, uneasy recalibration as the wild responds to a world that no longer behaves as expected. And within that process lies a truth that governs every ecosystem, no matter how harsh or stable it appears. In the natural world, survival is not guaranteed by instinct alone. When conditions shift, when timing changes, when roles invert, those who depend entirely on what once worked are often the first to pay the price. This is a story about those moments, about what happens when the balance quietly tilts and the night begins to decide outcomes in ways instinct was never designed to predict. When survival works, it does so quietly. Most animals never question the rules that shape their lives. They are born into systems already proven by time patterns of movement, timing, and behavior refined through countless failures. In the wild, these rules are not taught. They are inherited. And for as long as the environment remains familiar, they are enough. At the core of these rules is predictability. Predators hunt when visibility favors them. Prey move when risk is lowest. Heat, wind, terrain, and light combine to create windows of opportunity that repeat day after day. A chase unfolds the same way it always has. An escape follows a path that has worked before. Survival in this sense is not about creativity. It is about obedience to patterns that have already been tested. In open landscapes, speed and strength define the hierarchy. Those built to pursue rely on momentum, surprise, and endurance. Those built to flee depend on early detection and rapid retreat. Timing is precise. A few seconds too early or too late can reverse outcomes entirely. But when every participant understands the rhythm, the system remains stable. Losses occur, but they are absorbed. Balance holds. Yet these rules are never universal. They depend on conditions staying within narrow limits. Temperature must fall at the expected rate. Winds must carry scent in familiar directions. Darkness must arrive gradually enough for instincts to adjust. When these variables align, the ancient logic of survival functions smoothly. When they do not, the logic begins to fray. The natural world is governed less by absolutes than by thresholds. A predator can tolerate a slight change in light. Prey can adapt to a minor shift in temperature. But beyond a certain point, adaptation becomes miscalculation. An approach that once guaranteed safety becomes a liability. A tactic that once ensured success begins to fail. This is where the danger of rigid instinct emerges. Instinct assumes continuity. It expects tomorrow to resemble yesterday closely enough to justify the same decisions. But the wild does not promise continuity. It responds to pressure, scarcity, and subtle environmental change in ways that are often invisible until their effects compound. Consider the role of timing. In many ecosystems, survival hinges on arriving at the right moment, not first, not last, but within a narrow window where risk and reward are balanced. Miss that window and the cost rises sharply. Too early and energy is wasted. Too late, an opportunity vanishes or danger multiplies. The rules work only as long as the window exists. As environments grow more volatile, these windows shrink or shift. What once felt reliable becomes uncertain. Animals continue to behave as they always have not, because the strategy is flawless, but because abandoning it carries its own risks. Instinct resists change until change becomes unavoidable. This resistance creates tension long before any visible conflict occurs. Movements grow more cautious. Patterns stretch or compress. Decisions take longer. The system begins to strain not through collapse, but through hesitation. Survival is no longer about executing instinct perfectly. It is about recognizing when instinct is no longer aligned with reality. The wild does not adapt all at once. It adjusts unevenly. Some individuals, some species continue to thrive under the old rules while others falter. This uneven response creates new pressures, altering relationships that once felt fixed. Roles begin to shift. Advantages erode. What once defined strength loses clarity. This is the moment when survival stops being automatic. When following the rules no longer guarantees safety. When instinct, once the greatest asset, becomes a potential weakness. The laws of the wild are not broken in moments like these. They are tested. And what follows is not immediate collapse, but a gradual reordering one, shaped by small deviations, accumulating consequences, and the quiet realization that the world is no longer behaving as it used to. The shift begins without drama. At first, nothing appears wrong. The landscape remains familiar. The light fades on schedule. Temperatures drop as they always have. Life moves forward under the assumption that the night will behave the way it did yesterday. Instincts engage automatically, guiding movement with quiet confidence. A predator enters open ground at a time that has worked countless times before. The distance is right. The wind seems favorable. The moment feels routine. This is how survival is supposed to unfold, through repetition, not improvisation. For generations, this approach has been reliable, but something is different. Not enough to trigger alarm. Not enough to demand retreat. Just enough to create a delay. A hesitation so small, it almost goes unnoticed. The predator slows not out of fear, but uncertainty. The air carries less information than expected. Scents disperse unevenly. The night feels thinner. From the outside, the behavior looks unchanged. From within the system, it marks the first deviation. The prey responds instinctively, as it always has. Movement is timed for the expected gap. Escape routes align with terrain learned over countless nights. There is no panic, only execution. The rules are still trusted. They always have been. Yet the timing slips, not dramatically, not catastrophically, just enough. The moment of contact never comes. The chase, if it can be called that, dissolves before it truly begins. The predator abandons pursuit earlier than expected. Energy is conserved. Risk is avoided. On the surface, this looks like restraint, a smart decision even. But the outcome matters more than the intention. The prey survives not because it was faster or stronger, but because the system failed to align. The window closed too quickly. The conditions that once held steady shifted by seconds, then minutes. No rule was broken. No mistake was obvious. And yet the result is different. This is how imbalance enters the wild, not through error, but through misalignment. That night ends quietly. No bodies remain. No struggle marks the ground. By morning, there is no evidence that anything unusual occurred. Life resumes. Instincts reinforce themselves. The system appears intact. But beneath that surface, something has changed. The predator expended energy without gain. The prey learned nothing new, only that the rules still seem to work. The environment absorbed the interaction without consequence. And yet the deviation remains stored within behavior, waiting to repeat. On the following night, the same patterns are attempted again. The timing adjusts slightly, unconsciously, compensating for the previous failure. But the environment does not mirror the adjustment. Conditions shift independently, indifferent to expectation. Another opportunity dissolves. This time the hesitation is longer. The retreat happens sooner. The cost grows not in injury or death, but in efficiency. Energy is spent without return. The predator begins to avoid certain areas, not because they are dangerous, but because they are unreliable. Unreliability is the enemy of instinct. Instinct thrives on consistency. It assumes that patterns persist long enough to justify repetition. When outcomes begin to vary without explanation, instinct falters not dramatically, but gradually. Decisions become conservative. Movements shorten. Engagements are abandoned earlier than before. Across the landscape, these micro-adjustments ripple outward. Prey species sense reduced pressure in places once considered risky. They linger longer. They feed more openly. Not recklessly, but with subtle confidence. This is not adaptation yet. It is inertia. Both sides continue behaving as if the system will correct itself. And in many ecosystems, it does. Small deviations are absorbed. Balance reasserts itself. But here the environment has crossed a threshold that instinct cannot detect directly. The deviation repeats. Night after night, outcomes drift further from expectation. No single event signals failure. There is no dramatic turning point, just accumulation. What once required precision now demands restraint. What once rewarded aggression now penalizes it. The predator survives, but less efficiently. The prey survives, but with growing exposure. The system stretches unevenly, distributing risk. This is the first true consequence of misalignment. Survival continues, but its margins shrink. Energy budgets tighten. Timing loses clarity. Confidence erodes without conscious awareness. The rules are still followed, but they no longer guarantee results. And in the wild, when instinct stops guaranteeing survival, something else must begin to shape outcomes. Not strength, not speed, but the quiet forces that act after decisions are made after movements end, after opportunities pass. The night is no longer neutral. It has begun to choose differently. The next change arrives more slowly, almost patiently, as if the night itself is testing how much pressure the system can absorb. What was once an isolated deviation becomes a pattern. Areas that used to pulse with brief, intense activity grow quieter for longer stretches. Predators pass through without committing. Prey remain alert but less hurried. The balance has not collapsed, it has thinned. Another opportunity forms under familiar conditions. The wind shifts as expected. Darkness settles evenly. The terrain offers the same channels of movement it always has. From a distance, nothing suggests risk. Instinct responds accordingly. The approach begins. This time the predator commits more cautiously, adjusting pace to account for earlier failures. It moves with restraint rather than confidence, conserving energy, avoiding overextension. On paper, this should increase success. But restraint changes timing, and timing in this landscape is everything. The prey senses movement not sharply, but early. Not because the predator is careless, but because the margin has narrowed. A reaction triggers sooner than expected. Muscles tense, direction shifts. The escape does not need to be fast. It only needs to begin first. Again, the encounter dissolves. There is no chase worth sustaining, no clear advantage to press. The predator withdraws, not frustrated, but recalculating. Energy is too valuable to waste on uncertainty. Survival demands selectivity. But selectivity comes with cost. Each retreat reduces pressure on the landscape. Feeding zones remain active longer. Paths, once avoided, regain traffic. The prey does not grow bold, it grows efficient. It feeds earlier. It lingers slightly longer. Risk is still present, but it feels less concentrated. Over successive nights, this redistribution of behavior compounds. The predator's world contracts. Reliable opportunities become harder to identify. Movement focuses on narrower roots areas with stronger memory of success. But memory is now outdated. The environment no longer responds the way it once did. This is where instinct begins to lag behind reality. Instinct adjusts through repetition, but repetition requires consistency. When outcomes vary too widely, learning slows. Patterns blur. The predator does not fail outright. It survives, but survival alone is not enough. Energy intake falls closer to the minimum required. Margins tighten. The prey, meanwhile, does not recognize safety. It recognizes opportunity. The reduced immediacy of threat allows it to exploit moments that would have been unthinkable before. These moments do not last long, but they last long enough. Nothing dramatic occurs. No sudden reversal, no violent confrontation, just a steady shift in who benefits from hesitation. The environment amplifies this imbalance. Cooler nights extend the window of activity. Subtle changes in wind carry scent differently, breaking assumptions about distance. Familiar cues lose reliability. The predator senses this, but cannot isolate the cause. Instinct offers no clear alternative, only refinement of strategies that no longer align perfectly with conditions. The system enters a feedback loop. Reduced success leads to increased caution. Increased caution leads to fewer engagements. Fewer engagements reinforce the perception of risk. The predator becomes more selective still. Meanwhile, prey behavior adapts in parallel, responding to absence rather than presence. This is not evolution, it is delay. Both sides operate under inherited rules, stretching them rather than replacing them. But the environment has moved first. And the longer behavior lags behind reality, the more imbalance accumulates. The night grows quieter, but not calmer. Fewer confrontations mean fewer resets. Consequences linger longer. Small advantages persist instead of being erased. The system that once corrected itself through frequent interaction now drifts without adjustment. In this state, survival becomes asymmetrical. No one is winning decisively, but someone is losing ground slowly. Energy budgets tip. Movements shorten. Errors become more expensive because there are fewer opportunities to recover. The predator remains alive, but its role is changing. It no longer defines the night. It reacts to it. And in that reaction lies vulnerability. The wild tolerates imbalance only briefly. When pressure redistributes unevenly, something else must intervene to restore limits. Not through confrontation, but through processes that act beyond the moment of pursuit. The night has already shifted once. Now it waits for the force that will decide whether this misalignment corrects itself or deepens into something irreversible. The correction does not arrive through conflict. It arrives through accumulation. As nights pass with fewer decisive encounters, the landscape begins to carry what it once erased quickly. Failed hunts still leave traces disturbed ground. Discarded remains weakened animals that do not immediately vanish back into the system. Death has not increased, but its aftermath has begun to linger. At first, the change is subtle. A carcass lasts longer than expected. Insects gather where they normally would not. Scents hang in the air well into the night, traveling farther as temperatures drop. These signals do not announce danger directly, but they alter movement all the same. Animals begin to hesitate around places that should have been neutral by now. The predator senses this shift indirectly, not through threat, but through complication. Feeding sites feel crowded. Paths intersect more often than before. The absence of frequent confrontations has not produced calm. It has produced congestion. Opportunity becomes harder to isolate. Risk becomes harder to avoid. The prey responds differently. Lingering resources create short-term advantages. Easy access replaces urgency. Feeding stretches longer. Movement becomes less dispersed. What was once spread thin across the landscape starts to cluster, concentrating activity into fewer zones. Clustering is efficient until it isn't. The system that once relied on constant correction through interaction now struggles to reset itself. Each night that passes without resolution allows residues to build. Insects multiply faster. Bacteria spread quietly through contact points. Small scavengers move in, followed by larger ones. The landscape begins to feel heavier, busier, less forgiving. Instinct does not immediately recognize this as danger. There are no sharp edges to react to, no clear signal to retreat. But something fundamental has changed. The night no longer clears itself. The predator adjusts again, not by advancing, but by withdrawing further. Engagement feels increasingly costly. Competition grows unpredictable. What was once a solitary calculation now involves multiple variables that instinct was never meant to track simultaneously. This withdrawal accelerates imbalance. Without frequent disruption, the buildup intensifies. Feeding zones remain active too long. Disease finds pathways. Injuries go untreated. Energy drains, not through pursuit, but through avoidance. Survival continues, but efficiency collapses. The prey begins to pay a price as well. Concentration invites exposure. Paths overlap. Signals multiply. The very abundance created by reduced pressure becomes a liability. What felt like opportunity now carries unseen risk. The system tightens. Water sources become contested. Feeding grounds lose neutrality. The margin for error narrows on all sides. The absence of decisive interaction has allowed secondary forces to dominate forces that act slowly, relentlessly, and without regard for strength or speed. This is the paradox of restraint. When pressure drops too low, consequences rise elsewhere. The night once shaped by clear roles now feels distorted. Not chaotic, but unstable. The rules have not vanished, they have been drowned out by accumulation. Instinct still operates, but it is operating on outdated assumptions. Something must intervene to restore limits, not a stronger predator, not faster prey, but a process that removes excess without creating new conflict. A force that acts after the moment has passed, erasing what lingers too long and resetting the field for the next cycle. The wild does not correct imbalance through escalation. It corrects it through reduction. As the nights stretch on, the system edges closer to a threshold. Not a collapse, but a turning point where survival depends no longer on action during the chase, but on what happens after it ends. The environment is preparing for a different kind of intervention, one that does not rely on instinct, but compensates for its failure. And when it arrives, it will not announce itself through speed or strength. It will restore balance by deciding what is allowed to remain and what must disappear before morning comes. The intervention begins without altering the chase. No predator changes its tactics. No prey abandons its routines outright. On the surface, the night looks the same as it did before. Movement still follows familiar routes. Activity still rises and falls with temperature and light. But beneath that continuity, the excess that has been allowed to build is finally addressed. What lingers too long starts to vanish. Carcasses that once remained through multiple nights no longer do. Remains that would have drawn layers of insects and scavengers are reduced quietly, methodically, until they stop exerting influence over the landscape. Scent trails fade sooner. Gathering points dissolve before they can harden into patterns. This removal does not create drama, it creates absence. And absence reshapes behavior faster than confrontation ever could. Animals approach former feeding sites and find nothing. No signal to linger, no reason to cluster. Movement resumes its spread-thinning activity back across the terrain. Paths intersect less often. Competition loosens. Risk disperses. The predator senses the difference almost immediately, not as threat, but as clarity. Decision-making simplifies. The number of variables drops. Engagement becomes calculable again. Even failed hunts no longer compound into broader consequences because their aftermath no longer persists. The prey feels it too. Opportunities shrink back to their expected size. Feeding windows close sooner. The confidence that came from lingering resources erodes. Behavior tightens not from fear, but from renewed uncertainty. The night regains its edge. This correction does not favor one side over the other. It restores spacing. By removing what should not remain, the system reintroduces limits without escalating pressure. Disease loses momentum. Insects fail to concentrate. Secondary scavengers disperse. The buildup that once distorted the night is quietly dismantled. Instinct suddenly begins to work again, not because it has changed, but because the environment has realigned with the assumptions instinct depends on. Timing regains meaning. Absence once again signals safety. Presence regains its weight. The narrow windows that define survival reopen. This is how balance returns, not through domination, but through subtraction. The intervention never competes. It does not challenge strength or speed. It operates after decisions are made, after movement ends, after success or failure has already occurred. It shapes the consequences rather than the actions themselves. Over successive nights, the effects compound in reverse. Efficiency improves. Energy budgets stabilize. Behavior settles back into patterns that can be trusted because the environment once again behaves within the thresholds those patterns evolved to manage. The night grows quieter, but this time it is quieter because it is lighter. Less congestion, less residue, fewer consequences carried forward unnecessarily. The system breathes again. By dawn, there is no trace of intervention. Nothing to point to, nothing to credit. Only a landscape that functions as it should, harsh, unforgiving, but stable. This is the final lesson of the shift. When instinct fails, the wild does not replace it. It supports it indirectly, clearing away what instinct cannot account for. Balance is not restored by rewriting the rules, but by removing the excess that distorted them. And in ecosystems shaped by scarcity, the power to decide what disappears after the night can matter more than the power to decide what dies during it. By the time the first light reaches the horizon, the desert offers no explanation for what has changed. The ground is quiet. The air is clean. Nothing appears broken, and nothing appears repaired. To an untrained eye, the night has passed like any other. But the system knows the difference. What once lingered no longer does. Where excess threatened to distort behavior, absence has restored proportion. Movement spreads back across the landscape instead of collapsing into narrow corridors. Feeding resumes within limits. Risk becomes measurable again. The night has recovered its structure not by adding pressure, but by removing what never should have remained. This is how stability survives in environments that cannot tolerate waste. The wild does not rely on constant conflict to maintain balance. In fact, too much confrontation destabilizes more than it corrects. What keeps ecosystems functional is restraint mechanisms that shorten consequences, that prevent accumulation, that erase what would otherwise reshape behavior in unintended ways. Instinct depends on this restraint. It was never designed to track endless variables or respond to prolonged residue. It evolved to operate within clear margins where outcomes reset quickly and patterns remain trustworthy. When those margins are restored, instinct does not need to change. It simply works again. The night returns to its role as a filter rather than a burden. It sorts outcomes instead of compounding them. Success and failure remain local, temporary, contained. No single event is allowed to dominate what follows. This does not make the desert safer. It makes it viable. Life here remains difficult. Hunger persists. Mistakes still cost lives. But those costs no longer cascade beyond their moment. They are absorbed, erased, and redistributed back into the system without excess. Survival becomes possible not because danger is reduced, but because danger is kept proportional. What matters most in this process is rarely visible. It does not chase, threaten, or dominate. It does not announce itself through sound or speed. Its influence is measured in what fails to accumulate, in what is gone before it can distort the next decision. This is the kind of power that ecosystems depend on most. Not the power to end life, but the power to prevent aftermath from becoming momentum. The power to ensure that yesterday does not overtake tomorrow. As darkness falls again, the desert resets with quiet efficiency. Movements resume under familiar rules. Instinct regains its footing. The system holds not because it has grown stronger, but because it has been kept light. In the wild, survival is often attributed to strength, speed, or intelligence. But beneath all of those lies a deeper requirement: limits. Without them, even the most refined instincts fail. The night understands this, and every time it removes what should not last, it preserves what can. The cycle does not end with resolution. It settles into continuity. Night after night, the desert repeats this quiet correction without ceremony. No memory is kept. No lesson is recorded. Balance is not preserved through awareness, but through repetition. What threatens to linger is removed. What must endure is allowed to continue. The system does not evolve in a straight line. It oscillates constantly, trimming itself back toward function. This is why the wild rarely collapses all at once. It frays first. It stretches. It accumulates pressure in places instinct cannot immediately detect. And then, before that pressure becomes fatal, something intervenes, not to change behavior directly, but to reset the conditions behavior depends on. From the outside, this process is easy to miss. It leaves no dramatic evidence. No single moment can be pointed to as the turning point. The night simply becomes workable again. Decisions regain meaning. Outcomes regain proportion. In this way, survival in the desert is never about perfection. It is about tolerance. about how much deviation an ecosystem can absorb before correction becomes necessary. Too little pressure and imbalance spreads quietly. Too much pressure and collapse accelerates. Stability lives in between, maintained by forces that act after the moment has passed. This is the deeper architecture of the wild. Predators and prey shape the visible drama, but they do not manage its residue. That task falls to processes that operate in the margins after the chase, after the escape, after success or failure has already been decided. By morning, nothing remains to explain the night. And that is precisely the point. The desert survives not because every encounter is resolved correctly, but because unresolved consequences are not allowed to accumulate. What disappears protects what continues. What is removed restores clarity. The system holds because it is constantly being lightened. In the end, survival here is not defined by who acts most decisively in the moment, but by what ensures that the moment does not echo too long into the future. That is how the night keeps the desert alive. As dawn settles fully over the landscape, the desert offers no sign that anything has been corrected. There is no marker to indicate where excess once gathered, no trace of the forces that quietly intervened. The surface looks unchanged. Yet beneath that stillness, the system has been preserved. This is how survival endures in places where margins are thin. Not through constant adaptation, and not through dominance, but through control of consequence. The wild does not prevent failure. It prevents failure from multiplying. It allows mistakes, losses, and imbalance, then removes what would otherwise turn them into momentum. Instinct survives because it is protected from overload. Behavior remains effective because the environment is kept within the limits behavior evolved to manage. When those limits are threatened, correction arrives not as confrontation, but as erasure. The night does not choose sides. It does not reward one strategy over another. It simply decides what is allowed to remain when the moment has passed. And in doing so, it ensures that tomorrow is not overwhelmed by yesterday. This is the quiet truth of survival in harsh ecosystems. Life continues not because danger is rare, but because danger is kept brief. What vanishes protects what endures. What disappears makes balance possible again. And when darkness returns, the process begins anew, unseen, uncelebrated, but essential. The desert does not remember the night it was saved. It carries no record of what was removed. No trace of the forces that kept its balance intact. By morning, everything that mattered has already been resolved. The system moves forward without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement is unnecessary. Survival here has never depended on recognition, only on function. What endures is not a single strategy, but a condition. A landscape light enough to sustain instinct. A night that clears itself before consequence hardens into permanence. This is why life persists in environments that appear unforgiving. Not because they are gentle, but because they are precise. Every cycle reinforces the same quiet principle: survival is protected not by eliminating danger, but by limiting its reach. Loss is inevitable. Failure is expected. What cannot be allowed is accumulation. When darkness falls again, nothing changes on the surface. Movement resumes. Decisions are made. Instinct takes over. And beneath it all, the unseen work continues, ensuring that what should pass does, and what must remain can. In the wild, balance is never announced. The story does not conclude with certainty. It settles into rhythm. Nothing dramatic marks the end of this cycle. There is no final confrontation. No decisive victory. No visible shift that announces resolution. The desert simply continues functional, restrained, and intact. What mattered has already happened in the spaces between moments where excess was removed and balance was quietly restored. This is how the wild sustains itself over time. Not through perfection, but through correction. Not by preventing imbalance, but by ensuring imbalance does not persist long enough to reshape the system. Survival remains possible because consequences are shortened, not erased entirely. Instinct returns to the foreground once again, aligned with the conditions it evolved to navigate. Movements regain their meaning. Timing regains its value. The narrow margins that define life in harsh environments become manageable again, not because danger has vanished, but because it has been kept proportional. What operates here is not dominance, intelligence, or force. It is limitation. A constant, unseen process that decides what cannot be allowed to stay. Without it, even the most refined behaviors would fail under their own residue. The desert offers no explanation for this. It never does. It simply endures. And as night falls once more, the system remains ready, not because it has learned, but because it has been kept light enough to function. What persists after all of this is not a lesson that can be memorized, but a condition that must be maintained. In environments like the desert, survival is never secured once and for all. It is renewed nightly through processes that prevent yesterday from overwhelming today. The system does not depend on foresight or intention. It depends on removal. On the quiet assurance that outcomes, no matter how disruptive in the moment, will not be allowed to harden into structure. This is why the wild remains resilient even when individual strategies fail. Instincts break down. Timing slips. Roles blur. Yet the ecosystem does not unravel immediately because something else absorbs the pressure. Something that acts after behavior ends after decisions are made, after success and failure have already played out. The night performs this function without judgment. It does not reward caution or punish boldness. It does not favor predators or protect prey. It simply limits how long consequences are allowed to influence what comes next. In doing so, it preserves the narrow margins that life here depends on. From one cycle to the next, this restraint keeps the system from drifting too far in any direction. Too much pressure is reduced. Too much absence is corrected. Balance is not achieved through stasis, but through constant, subtle adjustment. The desert survives not because it is stable, but because it is continuously being stabilized. This truth is easy to overlook because it leaves so little evidence behind. There are no markers of intervention, no signs of repair, only continuity, only a world that still works the next day. And that is enough. As darkness returns, the same patterns will unfold again. Instinct will guide movement. Risk will shape decisions. Mistakes will be made. Loss will occur. None of that will change. What will remain constant is the unseen process that ensures those moments do not accumulate into something unmanageable. In the wild, survival does not belong to those who control events. It belongs to systems that prevent events from echoing too long into the future. The desert understands this, and every night, without spectacle or acknowledgement, it acts accordingly. There is no final scene to return to, because nothing ever truly ends here. The desert does not close chapters. It cycles. Each night resets conditions just enough for instinct to function again. And each morning conceals the work that made that possible. What appears unchanged is not static, it is maintained. This is the quiet paradox of survival in extreme environments. Life does not persist because it avoids pressure, but because pressure is constantly relieved before it becomes permanent. The wild tolerates imbalance briefly, then trims it away. What remains is not harmony, but usability, a state where movement, risk, and reward can still be calculated. Instinct survives only because it is protected from overload. It was never designed to manage infinite consequence, only immediate outcome. When consequences linger too long, instinct collapses under complexity. The desert prevents that collapse not by teaching new behaviors, but by restoring the conditions under which old ones still work. This process is invisible by design. Anything that announces itself would already be too late. Correction must arrive quietly, after attention has moved on, after the moment has passed. What is removed cannot be mourned, because mourning would mean it lasted too long. And so the system endures, not because every decision is right, not because every life is spared, but because no single failure is allowed to dominate what comes next. As night falls again, the desert does what it has always done. It allows danger, then contains it. It permits loss, then erases its excess. It keeps the future light enough to carry. That is how survival is sustained here, not through strength, speed, or foresight, but through restraint applied after the fact. The wild does not promise balance. It preserves the conditions that make balance possible. The desert never signals completion. It simply remains workable. That is the final measure of survival here. Not victory, not dominance, but continuity. Each night clears just enough of what threatens to accumulate. Each morning reveals a world that still functions, not because it is unchanged, but because it has been quietly corrected. Nothing about this process is dramatic. It does not demand attention. It leaves no evidence strong enough to become memory. And that is precisely why it succeeds. What cannot be seen cannot be interrupted. What is removed before it lingers cannot distort what follows. Instinct resumes its role without realizing it was ever at risk. Movements regain rhythm. Decisions regain proportion. The margins of survival remain narrow, but they remain usable. Life continues not easily, not safely, but sustainably. In places where resources are scarce and mistakes are costly, this restraint is everything. Survival depends less on decisive action than on the quiet assurance that consequences will not outlast their moment. The desert offers no lesson, no warning, no conclusion. It simply endures night after night by ensuring that what must pass does and what must continue can. The system does not celebrate its survival. It does not pause to reflect on what was prevented or corrected. It simply continues because continuation is the only outcome that matters. In the desert, endurance is not built on certainty. It is built on limits that are enforced quietly, long after attention has moved elsewhere. Every night trims away what threatens to harden into structure. Every morning reveals a world light enough to function again. That lightness, not abundance, not safety, is what keeps life moving. Nothing here is guaranteed. Hunger returns. Risk remains. Mistakes still carry cost. But those costs are kept brief, absorbed before they can shape the future too heavily. Survival persists because the past is not allowed to dominate the present. This is not balance as an ideal state. It is balance as maintenance. And as darkness gathers once more, the desert prepares to do what it has always done. Allow danger, then contain it. Permit loss, then limit its reach. Preserve just enough clarity for instinct to remain useful. That is how life endures here, not through control, but through restraint applied again and again, until continuity itself becomes the only lasting outcome. The desert offers no closing statement. It never has. What remains is a condition fragile, precise, constantly managed. A landscape where survival is possible only because excess is never allowed to settle into permanence. Each night performs the same quiet labor, not to perfect the system, but to keep it usable. Errors are permitted. Loss is inevitable. What is not permitted is wait. This is the unseen architecture beneath every movement. Beneath every hunt that fails, every escape that succeeds, every decision made on incomplete information. The wild does not rely on foresight to survive. It relies on correction after the fact, on the steady removal of what would otherwise distort tomorrow. Instinct alone could not sustain this place, nor could strength, speed, or intelligence in isolation. What allows life to continue here is restraint applied where instinct ends after action, after consequence, after attention has already passed. By morning, the desert looks unchanged. And that illusion is the proof that the system is still working. Nothing more is required. At this point, the cycle is complete. Nothing more needs to be added without breaking the balance the story itself describes. The desert has been returned to a state where instinct can function, where consequence does not accumulate, and where survival remains possible without escalation. Extending beyond this would no longer deepen the narrative, it would dilute it.